The morning was still, heavy with an unspoken weight, the kind of quiet that only settled over a city in the moments before something irreversible happened. Judge Marcus Taylor stepped out of his car in the courthouse parking lot, his polished shoes cutting through the soft hum of a sun-streaked autumn day. At 44, Marcus had seen more than his fair share of the world's darkness. But this morning, in the hollow calm of the nearly empty lot, he felt an old ache stir beneath his ribs, a quiet, unsettling awareness that he was never fully free. Not even here. He adjusted his suit, a deep charcoal tailored perfectly to his tall, broad frame, and checked his watch. Just another day, he hoped. His mind raced through the routine. Morning briefings, cases to review, decisions to make. But underneath it all, there was always the quiet hum of vigilance. The vigilance of a black man in a position of authority. In this courthouse behind the bench, he was respected, revered even. But the world outside, the world that watched him, that world didn't see him as a judge or a man of law. They saw the color of his skin, and that was always lurking beneath the surface, waiting to resurface when he least expected it. The parking lot was empty save for a few scattered cars, and the distant hum of traffic could be heard from the nearby highway, muffled by a row of trees lining the lot's edge. The scent of fresh asphalt mingled with the earthy smell of fallen leaves, a soft reminder of the change in seasons. A cool breeze picked up as Marcus walked toward the courthouse's front entrance, but the brisk air did little to ease the tension in his chest. Not today. His hand brushed over the door handle, ready to step inside and begin his day, when suddenly the sharp sound of screeching tires broke the stillness. Marcus turned, his gaze narrowing instinctively as a police cruiser came to a sudden stop behind his car. The lights flashed once, red and blue, and the air seemed to grow even heavier, thick with something unspoken, something he knew was coming, yet always hoped would never materialize. The officer's door swung open, and a young cop, Officer John Davis, stepped out, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the area with an unsettling intensity. Marcus didn't know this officer, but he had seen that look before. The kind of look that always made his pulse quicken. The kind that made you wonder, was it his uniform or the skin he wore? Marcus paused for just a moment, half a breath maybe, but in that space, everything changed. The sun had barely risen, but the weight of the world had already settled squarely on his shoulders. And as the officer's gaze locked onto him with unblinking certainty, Marcus knew the day's real battle was already about to begin. He straightened his posture, forcing his mind to settle, his expression unreadable. Just another day in the life of a black man in power. But today the game would be different. Today the price of being mistaken could cost him everything. The officer's steps were quick and deliberate, the sound of his boots sharp against the pavement as he approached Marcus. From a distance he seemed overly eager, as if he were hunting for something. Marcus, now standing perfectly still, felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle, a deep, primal instinct kicking in. He knew this feeling too well. He had felt it countless times before. The sharp, unblinking suspicion of authority, the assumption that his presence itself was a threat. Officer John Davis was young, no more than 30, with a tense, almost nervous energy that contrasted with the hardened look in his eyes. He was tall but leaner than most of the cops Marcus had dealt with over the years. His uniform was crisp, the badge on his chest gleaming under the early morning sun. But there was something about the way he carried himself, something about his posture, that suggested this was his first time walking the line between confidence and mistake. He seemed ready to prove something, to show that he wasn't one of those rookie cops who let things slip. The kind of cop who might mistake a judge for a criminal. When Officer Davis finally reached Marcus, the air between them seemed to stretch thin, taut with the weight of unspoken expectations. He stopped just a few feet from Marcus, his hand hovering near his holster as his eyes flicked from Marcus's face to the surrounding area, scanning for something he couldn't quite name. Davis said, "Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle." His tone was firm, authoritative, but there was a crack in it, a hesitation, like he was waiting for Marcus to make the wrong move. Marcus's brow furrowed slightly, but his expression remained composed. This wasn't new. It never was. Every black man knew the drill. The only difference was that he was a judge, and this officer didn't seem to care. Not yet. Marcus noted, "I'm not in my vehicle, officer. I'm on foot, and I'm heading inside the courthouse." His voice was steady, calm, but there was an edge to it now, a hint of irritation seeping through the layers of professionalism he'd built up over the years. Davis said, "I'm going to need to see your ID. We've got a report of a suspect in the area." "You fit the description." The words felt strange coming from him, as though he didn't entirely believe them himself. Marcus felt his chest tighten. He'd heard this before, but this time it felt different, dangerous. The officer's gaze was piercing, scanning Marcus's face with a scrutiny that felt personal, invasive. His body language was stiff, wary, like a dog who had been trained to bite before asking questions. This wasn't a request, it was an order. Marcus took a slow breath, exhaling through his nose. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, each second drawing him closer to something ugly, something irreversible. It wasn't just about the officer's demand, it was about the assumptions that lay beneath it. Marcus knew the drill all too well. A black man in a suit, walking to the courthouse, fit the description of a criminal in an officer's mind all too easily. Marcus replied, "I'm a judge. You can call it in and verify my identity. There's no reason to escalate this." He was careful with his words, trying to remain calm, trying to avoid the inevitable flashpoint that was brewing. But Officer Davis wasn't listening. His hand moved quickly, brushing against the side of his holster, as though he were preparing for something. And Marcus immediately tensed. The officer's voice was a notch louder now, a thin veil of impatience starting to creep in. Davis started, "I said, step out of the vehicle. I don't care who you are. We've got a suspect who matches your description, and I'm not taking any chances." Marcus stood there for a moment, eyes locked on Davis's. The officer's jaw was clenched tight, his grip tightening on the radio at his side. He wasn't just a cop doing his job. He was already judging Marcus, dismissing him, categorizing him as a threat before he even had a chance to speak. It was a moment of quiet recognition. Marcus knew this was more than just a traffic stop gone wrong. This was about the systemic biases that ran deep through the police force, through society itself. It wasn't about the truth of who he was, or the credentials he carried, or the power he held within the walls of the courthouse. It was about the color of his skin. It always had been. Marcus took a measured step back, his voice steady as he spoke. Marcus replied, "You're making a mistake. I'm not the person you're looking for. Please call your supervisor. I'm telling you who I am. I've got a full schedule ahead of me today." But Officer Davis wasn't listening. The tension in the air was palpable, and the officer's gaze flicked briefly to his radio, his fingers itching toward it. The younger cop's posture shifted, more aggressive now, and Marcus's heart rate spiked, an involuntary reaction to the mounting danger. Davis said, "I don't care who you say you are. Step out of the car now, or I will be forced to detain you." His voice was shaking now, both with authority and fear. He was afraid, and that fear was palpable, like a live wire running through the air. Marcus felt the tightness in his chest turn to something heavier, more suffocating. He was acutely aware of the cameras on the courthouse, the growing crowd that was beginning to form around them. He was aware of every eye, every whisper. And still, he knew that his identity, his status as a judge, meant nothing here. In the eyes of this officer, and in the eyes of the world that still saw him as just another black man, his title would not protect him. Marcus continued, "I'm not getting out of the car. You have no reason to arrest me." The words were out before he could stop them, and he immediately regretted it. This wasn't how he needed to handle this. He knew better than to escalate it. But in that moment, anger surged up, burning hot and blinding. The officer's face twisted with anger, and before Marcus could say another word, Davis's hand moved to his belt, grabbing hold of his cuffs with a practiced motion. He spoke through clenched teeth. Davis said, "You're resisting arrest. I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction. Now get out of the vehicle, or I'll be forced to use force." Marcus's eyes widened. This was happening. In front of the courthouse, in broad daylight, This officer was choosing to ignore everything Marcus had said. His title, his identity, his rights. None of it mattered in this moment. It was only the color of his skin that seemed to matter now. The sound of approaching footsteps, loud and hurried, made Marcus turn his head. More officers. Two more squad cars had pulled up behind them, and now the scene was turning into something much larger, something irreversible. The other officers, who had yet to fully assess the situation, saw a black man with his hands raised, locked in a standoff with one of their own. They didn't ask questions. They just saw the same thing Davis did. Another officer asked, "What's going on here?" Davis told, "This man is refusing to cooperate. He's a suspect in an ongoing investigation." The lie hung in the air like a bad taste. The moment the words left Davis's mouth, the world seemed to shift. Marcus could feel the officers' collective eyes on him, all of them evaluating him, sizing him up. He was no longer the judge. He was just another suspect, just another black man they needed to control. Marcus took a deep breath, fighting to keep his voice steady, his anger contained. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold it in. The situation was escalating far beyond what he had ever imagined. The crowd that had gathered, the officers mounting aggression, it all felt like a warning shot, like a signal that today he wasn't just going to be judged. Today he was going to suffer the consequences of something far larger than himself. But he had no choice now. There was nothing left to do but let this ride out and pray it wouldn't cost him everything. The tension in the air felt like a thunderstorm on the brink of breaking. Marcus could feel it, could taste it in the back of his throat. Every officer around him was now on edge, their hands twitching near their weapons, their postures rigid and ready to react. The crowd that had gathered around them was growing, murmuring anxiously, but none of them dared to intervene. The space between Marcus and the officers felt impossibly small now, like a fuse waiting to ignite. Officer Davis, still gripping his cuffs, took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. The threat in his gaze was clear. He was ready to make an example of Marcus, to show everyone around him that he wasn't going to let a suspect get the better of him, especially not one who dared to disrespect his authority. Davis said, "You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting law enforcement. Get out of the car now." His voice cracked slightly, as though the weight of his own words had started to set in. This was happening. Marcus stood still, his chest tight with the cold, suffocating pressure of the situation. He knew the drill. He knew the game. But this time the stakes were higher. This time, his identity as a judge, the years he'd spent building a reputation, the respect he had earned, none of it mattered. He was still just a black man in a confrontation with a cop, and the rules were different for him. Always had been. In that brief moment of stillness, something inside Marcus snapped. It wasn't rage, it was clarity. The realization that this moment wasn't about him anymore. It was about something bigger, something systemic. It was about a world that saw people like him, educated, accomplished, qualified, as nothing more than threats to be neutralized, whether it was in the courtroom, on the street, or in the parking lot of a courthouse where justice was supposed to be served. Marcus said, "This is not how this is supposed to go. You're making a mistake, officer. I'm not a criminal. I'm a judge." The words spilled out before he could stop them. His voice was calm, but it was strained, tinged with the weight of years of frustration and helplessness. This was supposed to be the moment where the law was supposed to recognize him, to respect him. But now the law wasn't on his side. The law wasn't even listening. The younger officers, still standing behind Davis, shifted uncomfortably. The quiet uncertainty was creeping into their expressions. Was this really happening? The officer who had been standing silently in the back of the group, a tall black man in his late 30s, seemed to waver. His gaze flicked from Marcus to the scene unfolding, his brow furrowing. He opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it again, unsure of his place in this. It was clear he didn't know what to make of what was happening, but there was something in his eyes. Something that made Marcus feel seen for the first time since the officer had arrived. Second officer said, "Davis, we need to calm down. This is escalating too fast." His voice was tentative, more an instinctual reaction than a command. But his eyes flicked nervously to Marcus, then back to Davis. The doubt was there, but it wasn't strong enough to stop what was happening. The power dynamic had already been set, and Davis was the one in charge. Davis's jaw tightened and his eyes locked onto Marcus again. His face was flushed, the veins in his neck pulsing with the strain of his escalating anger. It was clear now. He had made up his mind. He was not backing down. He was going to arrest Marcus no matter what. Davis ordered, "I told you to get out of the car. You're not going to tell me how to do my job." His words were sharp, biting. He was no longer questioning himself. He was justifying his actions, doubling down on his authority. And the longer this confrontation stretched on, the more his ego seemed to solidify. At that moment, Marcus felt the icy grip of fear coil around his chest, but he didn't let it show. He knew what happened when officers like Davis felt cornered, felt their authority being questioned. They acted on impulse. And in that moment, Marcus was acutely aware of the danger he was in. Marcus said, "I'm not resisting. I'm telling you who I am. I'm a judge. Please call it in. I've been trying to tell you." Davis said, "Enough. Get out of the vehicle now." His voice rang out louder, more forceful, and before Marcus could even react, Davis's hand shot out, grabbing Marcus by the arm and jerking him out of the car with a brutal force. The action was sudden, violent. The crowd gasped in unison, a collective breath held as the tension reached a breaking point. The officer's grip was unforgiving, as though he had been waiting for a reason, an excuse, to physically assert his control. Marcus's heart skipped a beat as he stumbled, his feet losing traction for a split second. His mind raced, but he didn't panic. Not yet. The officers were closing in now, their hands reaching out, but Marcus had the briefest moment to steady himself. His chest heaved, his mind racing with calculations. He had to stay calm, had to stay in control. But it was too late. As soon as Marcus's feet hit the ground, Davis tightened his grip, pulling him roughly toward the squad car. The crowd was growing louder now. People were shouting, some were filming. The sound of phone cameras clicking and recording filled the air, but it felt distant, like an echo in a dark tunnel. Davis, shouting, "Stop resisting! You're under arrest!" Marcus's hand went instinctively to his waist, and Davis misinterpreted the movement. He jerked back, his face twisted with anger. The officer's hand went to his holster, fingers brushing the handle of his taser. Marcus said, "Wait, I'm not resisting. Just, please." But the words barely left his mouth before Davis's voice erupted again, this time in a guttural yell. Davis said, "Get on the ground, now!" In that second, Marcus felt a surge of panic, the kind that every black man felt when faced with a cop who had already made up his mind, the kind that warned him of how quickly a moment like this could turn lethal. His heart hammered in his chest as Davis pushed him down, shoving his chest into the pavement. Marcus murmured, struggling, voice strained, "I'm a judge, I'm telling you, please." But it was no use. In the blink of an eye, the officer's knee pressed down on Marcus's back, and the weight of the world seemed to crash down on him. The pain shot through his ribs as his hands were cuffed behind his back, the cold metal biting into his skin. In the distance, the murmurs from the crowd grew louder, voices rising in alarm, some shouting for Davis to stop, others begging for the officers to calm down. But the damage was already done. The situation had already spiraled past the point of reason, past the point of de-escalation. Marcus felt his chest tighten with a flood of emotions. Anger, disbelief, shame, fear. But above all, the realization that no matter how many degrees, how many accomplishments, how many years of hard work he had behind him, it didn't matter. He was just another black man in the hands of a system that didn't care about the truth. Davis said, "You're going to learn some respect today, you piece of a..." The words were cut off by a sudden shout from the other officers, who had finally started to realize what had happened. Second officer said, rushing forward, "Davis, stop! This isn't what you think. He's a judge." The realization hit like a slap in the face, but it was too late. The moment had already passed, and now the damage was done. As the tension slowly began to deflate from the officers, Marcus lay there, pinned to the pavement, his heart still racing, his thoughts still spinning. It wasn't just the bruises or the cuffs that hurt. It was the unshakable knowledge that the world still saw him as a threat, no matter who he was, no matter what he had done. And now the consequences would follow, because when the system breaks, when everything falls apart in a moment like this, there is no going back. The world felt muffled as Marcus lay on the cold asphalt, his face pressed against the ground, the rough pavement scraping at his skin. His breathing came in ragged gasps, every inhale a struggle, every exhale an attempt to push back the suffocating weight of the moment. The heavy pressure of Officer Davis's knee on his back was crushing, both physical and psychological. It was a weight that made his chest tighten, the stifling sensation of being othered and belittled in a way that no title, no degree, no amount of achievement could ever erase. His hands were twisted behind his back, the cuffs digging painfully into his wrists. But the real pain was deeper, far deeper. This wasn't just about an arrest. This was about the system, about the structures in place that had led to this moment. It was about being a black man who could never escape the assumptions, the biases, the immediate criminalization. It didn't matter that he wore a suit. It didn't matter that he held a position of power. To them, he was just another threat. Through the haze of adrenaline and frustration, Marcus could hear the voices of the officers around him. The confusion was starting to bleed through. Officer Davis was still shouting, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. But the urgency in the air had shifted. The act was done. The arrest had been made. And now the aftermath was slowly unfolding. Davis said, shouting, "Get off the damn ground. He's not resisting anymore. Get him up." The tension that had once held Davis so firmly in control was unraveling. His grip on power was slipping as the weight of the situation began to settle in. There was no longer any question about who Marcus was. There was no denying the reality now. The officer who had first questioned Marcus, the second one who had urged caution, had finally stepped forward, his voice shaking with disbelief. Second officer said, "Davis, he's a judge. That's Marcus Taylor. He's the presiding judge in this district." The words were slow, deliberate, as if the officer himself was still trying to process what had just happened. Marcus could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the reality of the situation settling over him like a storm cloud. The officers, the crowd, even the cars driving by. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. The sudden realization of the mistake had begun to cut through the fog of confusion. But it was too late. The damage was already done. Davis said, gritting his teeth, "I don't care who he is." He was acting suspicious. He was uncooperative. "I had to." Second officer, "You didn't have to. You should have verified before you did anything. This is ridiculous." The words hung in the air, charged with a bitter, uncomfortable silence. The officer's tone had shifted from tense authority to something softer, more regretful. Marcus could hear the crack in his voice, the realization that things had gone too far, too quickly, but that wouldn't change anything now. Davis, spitting the words out, "He wasn't cooperating. He was threatening me. You saw the way he moved." Second officer said, "No, Davis, you saw what you wanted to see. You saw a black man who looked out of place, and you acted like you had all the answers." Marcus's thoughts swirled in a haze. He wanted to speak, to scream, to defend himself, to fight back against the injustice of it all. But his chest was constricted, and his mouth felt dry. The officer's words had an edge of truth to them, and even as they stung, Marcus couldn't help but feel the flicker of something deeper, a deep, searing anger. It wasn't just about the cuffs digging into his wrists. It was about a system that had spent decades forcing him, and so many others, into this same cycle. The scene had already begun to shift, though. The officers were still talking, but their words had lost their bite. Davis had gone from brash confidence to defensive agitation, his eyes flicking from the other officers to Marcus, unsure of what came next. It was clear now that the spotlight had turned, and Davis was no longer the unquestioned authority. The realization that they had wronged a judge, a respected public figure, was weighing on them in ways Marcus couldn't fully comprehend. But the pain, the humiliation, it was still there. It was still his. And it wasn't going to disappear just because The officers were now arguing among themselves. Then, as if the air had been sucked out of the world, the unmistakable sound of sirens began to cut through the haze. Backup. The cavalry had arrived. The first car screeched to a halt beside the scene, followed by two more, and a half-dozen officers flooded out of the vehicles, their boots slamming against the ground in unison. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. These were the reinforcements, the ones who would sort this mess out. Marcus could see the glances exchanged between the new officers, their eyes scanning the scene, their focus shifting between Davis and Marcus, trying to understand what had happened. One of the backup officers, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, walked quickly to the group, his eyes immediately landing on Davis. His gaze was sharp, analytical, more experienced than the others, more composed. He was assessing the situation, taking it all in. Backup officer asked, "What's going on here? Who's this?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. The moment felt suffocating, like all the air had been forced out of the scene. He could feel the tension in his neck, the sharp pang of humiliation that was threatening to choke him. Davis said, "This man is under arrest for obstruction." He wouldn't cooperate. "We were just," backup officer asked. "You arrested him?" His voice was sharper now, the implication clear. "What the hell were you thinking?" The older officer stepped forward, closer to Marcus. His eyes softened for a moment as they met Marcus's, and there was a brief flicker of something. Recognition, perhaps, or a rare moment of understanding. But it didn't last long. Backup officer. "You're a judge?" he asked, his voice steady but with a trace of disbelief. Marcus, gritting his teeth. "Yes, I'm Marcus Taylor. I'm the presiding judge of this district, and I've just been assaulted by your officer here." The words came out sharper than he meant, but the anger was spilling over now. The fact that he had to explain himself at all, that he had to justify his existence, who he was, to the officers who should have known better, it all came crashing down on him in that moment. The rage he had kept in check, the helplessness he had tried to contain, it all came rushing to the surface. Backup officer, nodding, still processing. "Okay, stay calm. We'll sort this out." His tone was professional, but Marcus could see the caution in his eyes. The sudden shift in how they were treating him, he could feel the difference. The respect they were giving him now that they knew who he was. But that respect hadn't been there before. Not until it was too late. The backup officers quickly moved in to de-escalate the situation, and within moments Davis was pulled aside, his own colleagues quietly taking control of the situation. They started speaking in low voices, and Marcus could hear the murmurs of reprimands, the tone now shifting to one of damage control. The backup officer stood over him, helping him up, his hands steady but apologetic. "Backup officer. We'll get you out of those cuffs, sir. I'm sorry this happened." But Marcus was beyond the point of wanting sympathy, beyond the point of expecting things to be fixed just because someone apologized. He had been humiliated, dragged through the mud, and his trust in the system had shattered long before this moment. The feeling of being powerless, of being less than in the face of authority, it was something he knew all too well. But this time, it was different. This time, the cost was even higher. As the backup officers stepped in, the crowd grew louder, murmurs of disbelief mixing with outrage. Phones continued to record, capturing every moment of this public spectacle. And in the distance, Marcus could see the flashing lights from other squad cars, their arrival signaling the undeniable truth. The fallout from this moment was far from over. The question now wasn't whether they'd let him go. It was what would happen next. Would the system protect him, or would it protect the officers who had broken it in the first place? Would anyone truly be held accountable? The days following Marcus's arrest blurred into a series of meetings, phone calls, and press inquiries. Each conversation felt like a weight added to his already burdened shoulders. But Marcus knew one thing with brutal clarity. He wasn't going to let this moment slip into the abyss of injustice. He couldn't. Not this time. Not after everything he had been through, everything that had led him here. His reputation, his career, his hard-earned status as a respected member of the legal community. It all felt like a distant echo now, overshadowed by the raw, painful reality of what had happened. Sitting in his office, Marcus stared out the window, watching the faint light of the morning sun filter through the blinds. His thoughts were chaotic, still tinged with the anger and disbelief from that night. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long, steady breath. The cuffs had left bruises on his wrists, but the mental scars ran far deeper. What they had done to him wasn't just personal, it was a symbol of something far bigger, a system that had failed him, that had failed countless others who didn't have the platform or the voice to fight back. The initial shock had passed, but the fire inside him hadn't died. If anything, it had only grown stronger. He had spent the past few days meeting with his legal team, reaching out to colleagues, gathering evidence. He'd already spoken with the Internal Affairs Division, though he knew well enough how these investigations often went. The officers involved would likely be given a slap on the wrist, a suspension maybe, but nothing substantial. Nothing that would change the course of systemic failure. Marcus knew that, but he wasn't about to let it go without a fight. He had already begun drafting a formal complaint to the department, detailing every injustice he had endured. It wasn't just about the unlawful arrest or the physical mistreatment. It was about the mental toll, the harassment, the underlying racial profiling that had driven this entire incident. But even as he wrote, part of him wondered if it would even make a difference. After all, who would truly listen to him? He was just one man, one black man, at the mercy of a system built on power and privilege. Yet that's exactly why he couldn't back down. Because if he didn't fight, who would? The door to his office creaked open, and Marcus looked up to see his longtime colleague and friend, Judge Evelyn Grant, standing in the doorway. Her face was etched with concern, but there was also a glimmer of determination in her eyes. She had heard about what had happened and had been one of the first to reach out to him, offering support. Evelyn said, "Marcus, I'm so sorry. I can't even imagine what you've been through." Marcus leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples. His exhaustion was starting to catch up with him, but he couldn't let it overtake him yet. Marcus said, "You don't have to imagine. You saw the footage. You heard the stories. What happened to me, hell, what happens to so many of us, that is the reality we live with." Evelyn nodded, her eyes hardening. She had spent decades fighting for justice in her own way, but even she knew that the fight Marcus was about to undertake would be one of the hardest of his life. Evelyn said, "You have my support, Marcus, and I know the other judges and attorneys in this district will back you. We can make sure this gets the attention it deserves." Marcus's eyes met hers, a flicker of gratitude passing through him. But he knew that support, while important, wasn't enough to move the needle. This was bigger than a few legal allies. This was about changing the culture within law enforcement, about holding the system accountable for the deep-seated issues that allowed incidents like this to happen, and happen with frightening regularity. Marcus said, "It's not just about me, Evelyn. This is bigger than one incident. It's about how we treat people like me, like us. It's about the culture of policing, the bias that's ingrained in the system. I don't just want an apology. I want real change. I want accountability." Evelyn stepped further into the room, her tone serious now. Evelyn asked, "What are you thinking? You're not going to just let it go, are you?" Marcus, shaking his head. "No, I can't. The thing is, Evelyn, I know how this works. I've been in the system long enough to know the patterns. The department will probably give me a settlement, maybe suspend Davis for a week or two. They'll say they're doing something to address it, and then they'll move on. Business as usual. I can't let that happen. Not again." He stood up from his desk, pacing as his mind started to shift into overdrive. His next steps were clear, but they were fraught with risk. There would be public scrutiny, media attention, and more than likely, backlash. He had no illusions about how hard it would be, but he couldn't stay silent, not when the injustice was this glaring. Marcus said, "I'm filing a lawsuit, a civil rights suit. I'm going public. I'm going to demand accountability, not just for me, but for the thousands of people who suffer in silence, for the families who have lost loved ones to police violence. This is my fight now." Evelyn's eyes widened. She knew how much courage it would take for Marcus to take such a public stance, but she also knew that this wasn't just about his own experience anymore. This was about something much larger. Evelyn said, "You're really going through with it, aren't you?" Marcus said, "I have to. I can't keep letting this happen. I'm a judge. I'm supposed to be a part of the system. But this system is broken. I've seen it from both sides, inside the courtroom and out. It's time for a change." He paused, his hand on the back of his chair, his gaze steady. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. She was taking in his words, weighing the magnitude of what he was saying. She knew the risks. She knew how high the stakes were. But she also knew that Marcus had the resolve to carry this through. And if anyone was going to spark real change, it was him. Evelyn said, "You know I'm with you, every step of the way." Marcus said, "I appreciate that, but this is more than just legal strategy or public opinion. This is a call to action. We need to push for more than just policy changes. We need cultural shifts. The way policing is done in this country has to change. And if I have to be the face of that fight, then so be it." His words were clear now, his mission solidified. This wasn't just a personal crusade. It was the beginning of a larger movement. Marcus had already started to gather allies. There were talks of community leaders, activists, and organizations that would support his cause. A public outcry was already beginning to form as news of his wrongful arrest spread. Media outlets were picking up the story, and though the coverage was spotty, the public was starting to listen. But it wasn't going to be easy. Marcus knew that. The power of law enforcement was entrenched, and the system would fight back. He had no illusions about the forces he was up against. But what he had now, what he had gained in the chaos of that night, was a fire for justice, for accountability, for change. A few days later, a press conference was scheduled. Marcus stood before the crowd, flanked by his legal team, his hands steady, his voice unwavering. The cameras flashed as he stepped up to the podium, and he could hear the murmur of the gathered crowd, the weight of the moment settling in. He wasn't just representing himself anymore. He was representing something much larger than that, a demand for systemic change, for recognition of the deep inequities that had existed for far too long. He spoke about the experience, about the mistreatment, the racial profiling, the way he had been treated as less than human. And then, with a calm resolve, he laid out his vision for the future. A future where no one, no matter their skin color or their station in life, would be unjustly targeted by those sworn to protect them. Marcus said, "This is about justice, not just for me, but for everyone who has been treated the way I was. This is about holding the system accountable, changing the way law enforcement operates, and fighting for a future where no one else has to endure what I've endured. The time for change is now." His words echoed through the room, and for a brief moment, Marcus felt the weight of his journey settle into a new, purposeful place. It was only the beginning, but he was ready to fight. For himself, for his community, and for a world where justice meant something more than just words on a page. As the days turned into weeks, the momentum behind Marcus's fight only grew stronger. The civil rights lawsuit he had filed became a symbol of resistance, not just for him, but for countless others who had faced the same injustices, who had been silenced or ignored by the very system meant to protect them. News outlets began to cover his story more widely, and soon his name became synonymous with the battle for reform. But it wasn't the attention that Marcus sought. It was the change. It was the action. Though the road ahead was uncertain and fraught with obstacles, Marcus's resolve never wavered. In the courtroom, he fought with everything he had. Outside of it, he became a powerful voice for the voiceless, speaking to communities that had long been marginalized, amplifying their stories, their struggles, and their pain. His story was no longer just about a black judge wrongfully arrested on a quiet suburban street. It had evolved into a rallying cry for a deeper, more urgent reckoning with the systems of power that had allowed this kind of injustice to persist unchecked. But it wasn't easy. Every victory, whether a small legal win or a breakthrough in the media, was met with fierce opposition. There were those who dismissed his actions as sensationalism, as an isolated incident that didn't warrant the sweeping reforms he was calling for. There were those who accused him of undermining law enforcement, of turning a personal grievance into a divisive public spectacle. But Marcus knew better. He knew that the fight wasn't about him. It was about creating a world where black men like him didn't have to fear for their lives every time they stepped outside, where children of color weren't born into a system that judged them before they ever had a chance. In the face of it all, Marcus held on to one undeniable truth. This fight was bigger than any one person. It was about breaking down the walls of systemic racism, of exposing the biases that had been woven into the fabric of law enforcement, the legal system, and society as a whole. It was about shifting the paradigm, challenging the idea that people of color were inherently dangerous or unworthy of respect, and replacing it with a new vision, one of equity, dignity, and justice for all. In one of his most pivotal moments, standing in front of a packed crowd at a rally for police reform, Marcus spoke not just as a judge, but as a man who had endured the weight of systemic injustice. His voice rang out, powerful and unwavering, carrying the message of every person who had been wrongly arrested, profiled, or punished because of their race. Marcus said, "This is not just about a single incident. This is about a legacy of injustice, of black and brown bodies being seen as less than. We can no longer afford to be silent. We can no longer afford to wait. The time for change is now. If we are ever going to build a future where our children are safe, where we can walk down the street without fear, where our lives matter, every single one of us must stand up, speak out, and demand justice.